Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Last time we saw in the dispute between the LeRoy Fiber Company and the railroad that if transactions costs were low, it didn't matter how the court initially decided the case, except for distributional reasons. But what if transactions costs are high? What if there are many LeRoys along the train's route so that there's not one transaction which has to be completed between the railroad and one LeRoy Fiber Company, but let's assume 100 different transactions that need to be undertaken between the single railroad and, let us say, 100 identical LeRoy Fiber Companies lined up along the track. So let me draw a little picture here. Here's the track. Okay. And let's assume that rather than there being one LeRoy Fiber Company, say over here, there's another LeRoy Fiber Company here, a third LeRoy Fiber Company, a fourth, and so on until there are 100 LeRoys all lined up, say 1 mile apart along the route between Chicago and Minneapolis that the railroad's trains have to go through. So let's further assume that the numbers between the railroad and each of these LeRoys are identical. That is, there are now 100 property rights at issue, 100 rights to throw sparks on the near area of the 100 LeRoy Fiber Company's yards. And let's assume that for each of the 100 owners, the value of that property right is $1,000, and that the value of the property right in each case to the railroad is $5,000. Okay? So now we have the same bargaining situation that we had between the railroad and the single LeRoy Company replicated 100 times. So what will happen? Well, we can imagine that the president of the railroad will get on a handcar, one of those things that rides along a railroad track and is propelled by a human being pushing a lever up and down. So we'll draw in a little handcar with the lever, and we'll put the president of the company on the handcar, and we'll have the handcar drive up to the first LeRoy, call this LeRoy number 1. And so the railroad starts to make a deal with the LeRoy Company. They spend a little time bargaining. It soon becomes apparent that the railroad is willing to pay enough to get the right from the LeRoy Company. And let's suppose that the railroad purchases the first of the property rights for $2,000. Then the first LeRoy Company doesn't have the property right, and the railroad company now has the property right. The LeRoy suffers $1,000 worth of damage, but is more than compensated by the $2,000 that the railroad has paid for the right. And importantly, the railroad, we could say, rings up a profit of $3,000 on that first negotiation. So we can imagine that after having done that first negotiation, the railroad chalks up on its ledger a $3,000 profit. That is, it has paid $2,000 to the first LeRoy Company in order to purchase a right that the company would have paid $5,000 to get. And so the difference is pure profit, surplus that the railroad receives by buying something for $3,000 that it would have paid up to $5,000 to get. Now the railroad president gets back on his handcar, he pumps the lever, and he goes to the second LeRoy Company, and they start doing the same deal. And let's suppose that the second LeRoy, LeRoy 2, also sells the right for $2,000, and so the railroad chalks up another $3,000 profit on the second of the negotiations that it undertakes. And so the railroad president gets back on his handcar and he drives to the third LeRoy. And now the third LeRoy begins to say to himself, it looks like the railroad is making out like a bandit on each of these transactions. And that's because each of my predecessor LeRoy companies, LeRoy 1 and LeRoy 2, are selling out too cheap. And so the third owner says to himself, well, maybe even though I know that the truth is that the property right is worth only $1,000 to me, maybe I can hold out to the railroad, lie to them, tell them that the property right is worth $4,000 to me or $6,000 to me, and then I can tap into that surplus that the railroad has realized from those first two purchases. That is, it's to everybody's advantage to have other people come to terms with the railroad so that that LeRoy, which has not yet come to terms with the railroad, is able to bargain with the railroad over a larger surplus than the earlier LeRoys were able to do. That is, as more and more deals are made between the railroad and some of the LeRoys, and the railroad surplus grows larger and larger and larger, the incentive for all of the LeRoys who have not yet made a deal with the railroad is to conceal their true values in an attempt to extract as much of the surplus that the railroad is realizing from the other deals in the deal that the railroad has to make with these people. So their hope is that if they're the 100th LeRoy and the railroad has hundreds of $1,000s worth of surplus in its ledger books, that the last LeRoy can say, okay, I'll sell you my right for $15,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 in the hopes that the railroad, having completed 99 transactions, will say, okay, we'll pay this extortionate price for the last property right. So, because of this situation, every LeRoy has an incentive to try to be the very last LeRoy that comes to terms with the railroad, and therefore have the opportunity to bargain over the maximum amount of surplus that the railroad can get. So this is a variant of what economists call the holdup problem. Every LeRoy has the incentive to be the last one to come to terms with the railroad, because if they're the last ones, then they're in a position to bargain over the largest surplus. And so, because of this incentive, every LeRoy tries to become the last LeRoy to bargain with the railroad, and so they all stall and refuse to bargain, and the railroad is unable to make any of the deals that it would have made, and which would have been mutually beneficial, not just to the railroad, but to all of the LeRoys as well. What we've seen is that absent this holdup problem, the company could make a deal with each and every one of those LeRoys, because each and every one of those LeRoys is a lower valuing owner of the relevant property right than the railroad is. But the holdup problem means that people have an incentive, the LeRoys have an incentive not to come to terms with the railroad until everybody else has come to terms with the railroad, which means that bargaining will not take place, and therefore those gains in economic value that could have been realized by the 100 separate transactions will not be undertaken. The transactions will not be undertaken, and so those gains in economic value will not be realized. So a decision for the railroad along Holmes's lines, that is to say, a decision that grants to the railroad a property right to throw sparks from carefully operated trains onto LeRoy's yard, makes all of the transactions that the railroad would have to undertake with the LeRoys, had the LeRoys been granted the property right initially, unnecessary. Because under Holmes's rule, the railroad, the higher valuing property owner, would have been given the property right in the first instance, and therefore no transaction, and therefore no attendant transactions costs, would be necessary in order to move those property rights from a lower valuing owner until the higher valuing owner. And so Posner, in this case, would agree with Holmes by saying if transactions costs created by the holdup problem are so large that the transactions that would be necessary to move property rights from the lower valuing LeRoys to the higher valuing railway would not be undertaken, then efficient allocation can only be realized if the court grants the relevant property right to throw sparks into the near area of LeRoy's yard to the railroad company. Of course, as I've suggested, this assumes that the court knows that the railroad is the higher valuing owner, and that's something it can only determine in terms of the evidence which is presented to it in court. So all of this suggests that efficiency can be achieved by an appropriate decision by the court, though this decision to realize efficiency, in this case, will have been made at the expense not just of one LeRoy, but of every LeRoy. That is to say, a new property right, the right to throw sparks from a carefully operated train into the near area of the LeRoy's yards, this new right would have been determined by Holmes's jury and awarded to the railroad at the expense of the LeRoy companies. The railroad would be allowed to throw sparks without fear of liability, and the LeRoys would be therefore required to take account of the railroads doing this and reorganize their yards so as to account for the sparks and thereby cost themselves some money. So efficiency would be achieved by the application of Holmes's rule and Posner's corollary in this case, but it would be done perhaps at the expense of justice if we believe that justice required that the railroad buy the right from the LeRoys. If we sympathize with the LeRoys, if we think that justice requires that they have the right to profit from the railroad's tossing of sparks in their yard, then Holmes's rule would do an injustice. If, on the other hand, we believe that justice is not something that courts can do easily or fairly, that is, that justice can't be done in an unarbitrary way, then efficiency provides a standard on which all sides can agree if the court is correct in determining who the highest valuing property owner is. And so, Posner's corollary, as you can see, has great practical significance in the real world where transactions costs are high. Where transactions costs are high, Posner shows, efficient allocation of property rights can only be achieved if the higher valuing owner is given the property rights for free in the initial allocation by the court. But this may do distributional injustice by giving a property right to the higher valuing owner for free and thereby denying the lower valuing owner of the property right the opportunity to share in the profits or the value that will accrue to the higher valuing owner from that owner's possession of the property right itself. In the next lecture, we'll talk about these distributional concerns more explicitly in a case where transactions costs are very low.